started working in shelters in 1989, and I worked in a shelter for 6 years before I went to vet school. And so one of the things I spent a lot of time doing was cleaning and disinfecting animal housing areas and my animal control vehicle and countertops. And this is one of the ways that I showed the animals that I loved them, was to just clean the hell out of their environment every single day. And one of the first moments when I was in vet school, and I thought, my gosh, you know, somebody really needs to connect what veterinarians know with what people working in shelters need to know, is when I found out that the disinfectant we were using, called Parvostop, was ineffective against the class of viruses that included parvo. And I mean, it's kind of funny, but I spent hundreds, maybe thousands of hours spraying that stuff around, not because I enjoyed the smell, but because I wanted to protect the animals that were in my shelter. And so in the time that I've been fortunate enough to be able to spend all my professional life studying these things, I've accumulated a lot of information, not only about what works, but about what doesn't work. And I think knowing what doesn't work is one of the most important things that we can know, because we all have a lot that we need to do with our limited time and resources. And if we can stop doing things that don't work, then we can focus our energy on the really important practices that really can help us save lives. I want to point out a couple of things. Do you all know sheltermedicine.com? A lot of nodding heads, but if you don't, check it out. We've updated our sanitation information page pretty recently, so if you want a written out form of this PowerPoint, you can go there to read more and see some additional resources. And do you all follow us on Facebook? Excellent. We're trying to catch up with the ASPCA, and as of last count, well, as of this morning, we had 3,081 followers, and I stopped counting when they were up over 900,000. But we just found out our 3,000 followers have 3,000 friends each. So if they could just get their 3,000 friends to follow us, we'd be almost there. And since I'm not in the social media workshop, I need your help. Please follow us on Facebook. If you do Facebook, and if you don't, get your friends or your children or your coworkers to do so. So I think a lot of you are familiar with this, but I just want to mention it. There's different ways that disease spreads. Disease is carried in all kinds of fluids and things that fall off of and are in animals. Hair and saliva and feces and urine. And then there's different methods by which it spreads. So direct contact is one method, obviously. And that's something that's relatively within our control. So when we have animals that we know are at risk of transmitting the disease, we can prevent direct contact. Airborne spread is another way that disease can spread. That's probably the hardest one to control. The good news is, though, that if you control all the other means of spread, you can often do a very good job of controlling even the spread of diseases that are airborne. So you can protect most animals from airborne disease spread, even if you're keeping animals in the same airspace. The other piece of good news is that airborne spread is not really an issue with cats. How many of you already knew that? Okay, a few, possibly because you've heard me going on about this for the last decade. But this was another thing that was kind of stunning to me. We've actually known this since the late 70s. That cats just don't have the lung power to generate a true aerosol. So they can sneeze, they can spray germs and saliva and mucus about 5 feet, but they can't generate an aerosol that floats up into the air and across a room and down a hall and lands on another cat. So that's good news. They can certainly, and they're skillful at this, they can ensure that their hair is coated with everything that's in their feces, because they sit in their litter pans. And they can coat their hair with everything in their saliva. And then their hair can float around. But really, the volume of hair floating around is not so important. What's really important is what we carry on our clothing and on our hands. So it's kind of good news, bad news. We are the ones who spread disease most effectively in a shelter-type environment. And that's by means of being fomites. You all know what a fomite is? It's any object that serves to spread disease from one organism to another. So it could be your hands, it could be this podium, it could be a cage or a carrier, it could be the back seat of your car. is anything that becomes contaminated with a germ, a virus, or bacteria and spreads it to another animal. So this is the other thing that I wanted to just talk about in brief, that there's not a one-to-one relationship between exposure to a germ and illness. So we're all exposed to germs all the time. Just heard somebody hacking. We're perfectly capable of generating an aerosol, so maybe a few viral particles to spread a few chairs down. But luckily, we have immune systems, and we can withstand some disease exposure, and so can animals. They can withstand more disease exposure if their immune system is in better shape. And sometimes, keeping their immune system in good shape means not keeping them in a perfectly sterile environment. And so we have to really balance preventing exposure to disease with maintaining the animal's well-being, lowering their stress level, and encouraging the behaviors that help them protect themselves against disease, which includes normal eating, elimination, and grooming. And we can also know that when we're dealing with an animal that likely doesn't have a very strong immune system, and that is animals that are highly stressed, that have immunosuppressive diseases, and juvenile and geriatric animals, then we can know that those are the populations where we need to take extra care. And when we're dealing with a healthy adult animal that's in good shape and not going through a big trauma, we can know, you know what, be a little bit more relaxed about that one. Don't be so obsessive about not exposing that animal to germs. Go ahead and, you've got cats up for adoption, pet them all. Don't worry so much about sanitizing your hands between each animal or casual disease exposure between animals. When they're adult animals, they're vaccinated, they're in good shape. So I also wanted to mention we have what's called a threshold for infection. That's where the animal actually gets infected from exposure. And we can raise or lower that threshold depending on where the animal's immune system status is. And then we also have a threshold for systemic spread. So even if we don't do a perfect job and the animal might get a mild infection, we can still potentially prevent a severe infection. So some of you might have seen that. Sometimes you'll get a respiratory infection in a dog or a cat that's just mild, and they sneeze for a few days or they cough a little bit, but they don't go off feed, they don't get a fever, they don't get really, really sick. And then other times it progresses to something more serious. So there's a lot of room for us to make incremental progress in just reducing the dose that animals are exposed to, so that maybe for some of them we can prevent infection, and for some of them we can prevent systemic spread. And for some of them we can prevent exposure entirely. So it's sort of good news, bad news. Every little bit helps reach the tipping point. And on the other hand, if you've got one huge factor weighing against you, you can't tip it necessarily towards health. So for instance, I was visiting a shelter where dogs were group housed from the time that they were admitted to the shelter, and some of the dogs in that group housing were sick. And the veterinarian was worried about birds flying in and out of the kennels. And you get to worry about birds flying in and out of the kennels when you're doing everything else perfectly. And really look at what are the different sources of exposure and pick off the biggest ones. And don't waste your time worrying about birds flying in and out. Spend the time you would have spent worrying about that, harassing people not to group house stray dogs with sick dogs. So we know, basically, sanitation is not a bad thing, right? In the perfect world, we protect animals from disease. We also protect staff, client, and visitor health. And it's important to realize that that's something, sometimes there are things we do that are really mostly for people protection and not for animal protection. And routine use of hand sanitizers is a great example. Even though we might not be spreading disease from cat to cat to cat if we go up and pet all the healthy cats up for adoption here, if then we eat something and we're a visitor to the shelter and we're not used to all the stuff that these cats have, the visitor actually could get sick. So even though we're not maybe worried about disease transmission to the cats, we have to be cognizant of disease transmission to the shelter guests, volunteers, and staff. Also, it creates, ideally, a pleasant and welcoming environment. It smells good, seems like a place where animals would be healthy and you would want to adopt a pet. And we can protect the environment and use our resources wisely, not spraying unnecessary chemicals into the environment and into our water system. What's the worst thing that could happen? Well, I already talked about one bad thing. It could waste your time. And it's wasted a lot of my time. It could waste money. It could waste chemicals. It could actually serve to spread disease efficiently. And in fact, cleaning time is probably the highest risk time for disease spread in many shelters, because that's the time you're interacting with a whole lot of dirt and interacting with a whole bunch of animals and a whole bunch of housing areas. And sometimes removing the animal from its own cage and its own environment where it was used to the germs that it was exposed to. And in a real worst case scenario, could cause direct toxicity to both animals and workers. So here's an example of failure to work. This was a disinfectant that was broadly effective, was in use at this shelter, and I don't know if you can really appreciate that, but it was an area of unsealed concrete, and there's some dips and irregularities, and so water pooled there. And we took cultures from the water pools, the pools of water and disinfectant from a freshly cleaned kennel, and we cultured the same bacteria that killed the dog in this picture. And it wasn't a bacteria that was very hard to kill in terms of which disinfectants would work. That disinfectant should have worked, but it couldn't work in a moist area, so failed to work. And the consequences were severe. So just sealing surfaces and making sure that they can be mechanically cleaned and effectively dried is really important. Could cause direct toxicity to animals, so that's a scrotal burn from disinfectant that wasn't properly rinsed. In the right hand or your left hand picture, and the picture of the cat, that's a call that we got for cats that had pneumonia, acute respiratory disease, fevers of up to 108 degrees, and one of the cats died. We thought it was an outbreak of virulent calicivirus, and it turned out that the top had gotten left off the quaternary ammonium disinfectant container, and it was applied at too high a concentration, and that's a classic appearance. Virulent calicivirus, really bad. Quaternary ammonium toxicity, if you catch it before the cats have severe pneumonia or before they die, bathe the cats, rinse the environment, provide pain control, broad-spectrum antibiotic, and all the other cats were fine within 3 days. So important to prevent, important to know about it and recognize it. And then we have disease spread through cleaning, which is probably the most common, although a less dramatic adverse consequence of cleaning. How many of you are in the position of having to use mops? So you know, if whatever's in the mop water isn't killing off whatever disease is on the mop, that's a very efficient way to spread disease from one area to another, where the animal doesn't go from area to area, but the disease actually does. And a lot of times the way that cats are housed, cat cage cleaning is a high contact sport. And remember what we said about hair and contact with clothing. If we take cats out of the cage and put them against our bodies or put them in another cage that's not well cleaned, we actually can spread more disease through cleaning than we prevent. This is dishes being washed with toys and litter pans. And then just a dog being tied out during cleaning of single dog runs, and there wasn't enough room to give each dog 2 runs and just swap it back and forth between 2 runs that belong to that dog. And you can just see from the footprints how many other dog feet prints, invisible feet prints, it could be being exposed to. So we're going to talk about solutions to some of those problems. So the basics of creating a sanitation plan: pick the right products, pick the right process, pick the right places, write it all down, and then see if it's working. Sounds pretty simple. And it is, in a way.